There is a moment from the last 24 hours that everybody in hip-hop is going to remember, and almost nobody has properly explained yet, because what just happened on Mikal Bridges' Instagram, Live the Night after the New York Knicks won the NBA championship, was not a viral clip. It was not a feel-good story. It was a public confession that broke a 4-year-long argument wide open in real time. A grown man who just reached the absolute peak of his profession. A Villanova kid turned NBA champion, drunk, sleep-deprived, on camera in front of thousands of strangers, paused a celebration to admit that he had been clinically depressed, that he thought he was not going to make it through the loss in Phoenix and the loss in Dallas, and that the only thing that pulled him out of that hole was Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And the song that triggered the confession was Count Me Out. And the moment Jalen Brunson reposted that clip, the entire conversation around the most divisive Kendrick Lamar album of his career flipped on its head. Because everything Drake said about that album, everything J. Cole tried to walk back about that album, every single person who called Mr. Morale a brick or tragic or self-indulgent or unlistenable just got publicly humiliated by an NBA champion crying on Instagram Live. And here is the part nobody is ready for. This is not just a feel-good viral moment. This is the receipt that ends one of the longest Cold Wars in modern hip-hop. Because when we get to the section in this video where I break down what Mr. Morale actually did to Drake's confidence behind the scenes, why he showed up at the Big Steppers tour months before he ever publicly attacked the album, and what the contract structure of the modern major label rap economy has to do with why this album was systematically buried by mainstream rap media for 2 straight years, you are going to understand that what Mikal Bridges did on Live is not the story. The story is what his confession just forced into the open. So before we get any deeper, before I name names, before I walk you through the receipts, before I break down the part the streaming platforms do not want anybody touching, we have to do this the right way. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now to understand why this moment matters, and why what Mikal Bridges said on Live is being treated by people inside the culture as a closing argument, and not just a fan moment, you have to remember the war this album walked into. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers dropped in May of 2022, debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200. And from the second it landed, the reaction was split down the middle in a way no Kendrick Lamar album had ever been split before. On one side, you had a community of listeners who treated it like a private letter that had somehow gotten delivered to all of them at the same time. People who were depressed, people who were healing, people who had been carrying things they did not have language for until Kendrick handed them the language on songs like Mother I Sober, Count Me Out, United in Grief, and Anti-Diaries. On the other side, you had a chorus of rap fans, rap critics, and competing rappers who decided very quickly that an album with no obvious club records, no Rap Caviar singles, no easy radio play, and no clean, packaged identity was a failure. It was called self-indulgent. It was called therapy on wax. It was called a brick. The most damaging label came 2 years later in 2024, when Drake, in the middle of the biggest rap beef of the decade, openly used Mr. Morale as a punchline, calling it a brick. And J. Cole around the same window referred to Kendrick's most recent output as tragic before publicly walking it back at Dreamville Fest. And the stakes here are bigger than just one album's reputation. The stakes are about what hip-hop is allowed to be in the 2020s. The stakes are about whether the genre that built itself on truth-telling, vulnerability, and confrontation with the self is going to be flattened into background music for clout-chasing and clip culture, or whether it is still allowed to be the most honest art form in popular music. The stakes are about whether a generation of young black men in particular, men like Mikal Bridges, men who are not supposed to talk about depression in public, men whose entire profession requires them to perform invincibility, are going to be allowed to have a record that meets them where they actually live. And the stakes are also financial and structural, because in the streaming economy, an album that asks the listener to sit down, put their phone away, and engage in self-reflection is structurally disadvantaged against an album designed for passive listening. Every metric the modern music business uses to measure success is biased against what Kendrick did with this record. Which means the question this entire video is going to answer is simple. If Drake was right, why is the NBA's newest champion crying about Count Me Out on Live 4 years later? And if Drake was wrong, what was the real reason he needed everyone to believe Mr. Morale was a failure? Because both of those questions point at the same answer. And that answer is the conversation we have not been allowed to have until right now. Let's start with the surface, because the surface alone tells a story that should have ended the debate years ago. Piece of evidence #1, the Mikal Bridges Live itself. Within hours of the Knicks closing out their championship run, Bridges hopped on Instagram Live, started playing his personal celebration playlist, and as he is going through his rotation, Count Me Out comes on, and the entire energy of the room shifts. He is not lip-syncing for fun anymore. He stops, he pours another drink, and he turns into the camera and says, and I am quoting as closely as the public clip allows here, that he was really depressed, that after the loss to Phoenix and the loss to Dallas, he was in a dark place, that this album was what got him through it, that he loves this album, and that he is never going to forget this album. This is a man on top of the basketball world, a man who just signed one of the biggest trades in recent NBA history, a man whose face was on every sports network in America, sitting on live confessing to clinical-level depression and pointing at a 2022 Kendrick Lamar album as the reason he is still standing. Jalen Brunson reposted it. The clip went viral immediately. And not viral in the disposable sense, viral in the way that things only go viral when they hit something everyone was already feeling but nobody had said. Piece of evidence number 2. Look at the comment sections under every repost of that clip. Look at the Reddit threads on our /Kendrick Lamar and our /HipHopHeads. Look at the quote tweets. You are seeing thousands and thousands of people, complete strangers to each other, posting their own personal Mr. Morale stories underneath this NBA champion's confession. People talking about the year they thought they were not going to make it. People talking about the songs that saved them. People talking about Mother I Sober and what it meant to hear a black male rapper publicly process generational trauma the way Kendrick did on that track. That is not an album that bricked. That is an album that built a private congregation that has been waiting for permission to come outside. Piece of evidence number 3. The chart and streaming data, which the Drake camp does not want you to look at because it tells on them. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It was certified platinum extremely quickly. It produced sustained streaming numbers on songs like Count Me Out, Die Hard, and N95 that have only grown over the 4 years since its release. The album was not a commercial failure. The narrative that it was a commercial failure was manufactured. Piece of evidence number 4. The Big Steppers tour itself. This was one of the most acclaimed live music productions of the entire decade, a full theatrical experience that pulled critics from outside the hip-hop press, that played to sold-out arenas globally. And this is the part that becomes critically important later in this video. It was a tour Drake himself was reportedly spotted attending. That is documented. That is on the record. A man does not show up to a tour for an album he genuinely believes is a brick. He shows up because something on that record made him need to see it with his own eyes. Now you have 4 pieces of surface evidence on the table. The viral confession, the mass community testimonies, the actual chart data that contradicts the brick narrative, and the tour Drake himself attended. And we have not even started talking about what people inside the culture have been saying. And oh, do I have more for you? Because if you thought the Mikal Bridges moment was the whole story, you have not seen what other people in the building have been saying about this album. And the part where I named 3 specific artists who basically copied the Mr. Morale blueprint to launch their own career-defining records is coming in just a couple of minutes. And trust me, the Drake fans in particular are not going to enjoy what is about to be laid out here. Because the cultural evidence, the artists, the celebrities, the insiders, the people who would never go on the record about something they did not actually feel, that evidence is so much more damning than the surface numbers. And the way it stacks up is going to make the brick narrative look like exactly what it always was. So let's go layer 2. Cultural evidence. People with actual standing in the culture, on the record, in public, defending this album in the language of people who needed it personally. Start with Tyler, the creator. Tyler has cited Mr. Morale repeatedly, openly, in interviews, on stage, and in his own creative work. When Tyler released Chromacopia in 2024, the critical consensus from inside the culture was immediate. This was Tyler's Mr. Morale. This was Tyler taking the permission Kendrick had given to a generation of artists to make a long-form, deeply personal, identity-confronting album, and using that permission to make the most vulnerable record of his own career. That is not a coincidence. That is one of the most influential artists in modern hip-hop publicly building on the foundation that Mr. Morale laid. Second piece of cultural evidence. LeBron James, one of the biggest cultural amplifiers on planet Earth, has openly aligned himself with Kendrick across this entire era. His public support for Mr. Morale and the G-Next run that followed it has been consistent, public, and unambiguous. When LeBron co-signs something inside hip-hop, the entire culture moves. That has happened here. Third piece of cultural evidence. Eminem, reportedly left speechless by what Kendrick did in this run. A rapper who has built an entire career on technical command and emotional control listening to a younger artist do something he had never publicly seen done at that scale. and reacting to it the way every rap legend has always reacted when a torch gets passed, with a visible recognition that something has shifted. Fourth piece of cultural evidence. The Big Steppers tour reception from artists who attended. This is where it gets specific, and this is where the Drake situation becomes impossible to explain away. Drake was reportedly spotted at the Big Steppers tour before the public phase of the beef. Now think about what that actually means. The man, who would 2 years later publicly try to dismiss this album as a brick, took the time, in the middle of his own touring and recording schedule, to physically show up to the live presentation of the album he wanted everyone to believe was beneath him. There are only two interpretations. Either he was scouting it because he understood it was a threat, or he was personally drawn to it for reasons he was never going to publicly admit. Either interpretation destroys the brick narrative. Now, I want to be fair here, because the standard counterargument is that an artist can attend another artist's show without endorsing the work. And that is true in general. It is not true here. Because if Mr. Morale was actually a brick, if the album was actually as bad as the public posture later claimed, then there is no scouting concern and no curiosity concern. You do not study a flop. You study what you are afraid of. And the timeline of Drake's behavior, the show attendance, followed by years of public silence on the album, followed by the brick line dropping at the exact moment the beef went nuclear. That is not the timeline of a man who genuinely thought the album was bad. That is the timeline of a man who needed the audience to believe it was bad because the alternative was too dangerous to admit. And on top of all of that, you have the broader pattern of artists across the genre quietly adopting the Mr. Morale template, the long-form personal album, the therapy room confessional, the willingness to put the artist's own family and trauma on the record as the new prestige format in mainstream hip-hop. That is not the cultural footprint of a brick. That is the cultural footprint of a blueprint. And the moment Mikal Bridges sat on live and confessed what that album did for him personally, every one of those cultural data points snapped into focus at the same time, and the picture became impossible to argue with. Which brings us to the part of this story that nobody on either side of the Drake-Kendrick debate has been honest about. Because to be honest about it would require admitting how the music industry actually works in 2025. And that is where we need to go next. Now I need you to lock in for this next part, because we are about to leave the music conversation and go into the part of the story that the streaming platforms, the major labels, and the playlist gatekeepers absolutely do not want the average rap fan to understand. The reason Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers was systematically labeled a brick by mainstream rap media for 2 straight years has very little to do with the music itself, and almost everything to do with the structural reality of how the modern major label rap economy decides which albums get celebrated and which albums get buried. There are 3 interconnected systemic angles here, and once you see them, you will not be able to unsee them. Angle 1 is the streaming economy itself. In the current streaming model, the financial incentive for both labels and artists is engineered around passive listening, short songs, hook-loaded production, immediate gratification within the first 15 seconds, and structures that allow the listener to keep the music on in the background while doing something else. The economic unit of the streaming era is not the album. It is the playlist slot. And Mr. Morale was an album that was structurally hostile to playlists. Songs like Mother I Sober run over 6 minutes, do not have hook-driven radio structures, and demand active attention from the listener. From a pure streaming economy standpoint, this is the worst possible product. Which means every algorithmic surface, Spotify's editorial playlists, Apple Music's rap rotations, Tidal's curated experiences, had a built-in bias against the record. The album was not buried because it was bad. It was buried because the system that decides which rap albums get pushed in 2022 is designed to reward the opposite of what Kendrick made. Angle 2 is the rap media ecosystem. Mainstream rap media in the 2020s is downstream of label relationships, advertiser relationships, and access journalism. The biggest rap media properties in the country need consistent access to the biggest commercial rap stars to keep their content engines running. And the biggest commercial rap star of the last decade, by raw commercial output, is Drake. Which creates a situation where any rap media property that takes a hard pro-Kendrick stance on a contested album risks losing access to the Drake camp and the broader OVO and label-aligned ecosystem that publishes constantly. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is access journalism. The brick narrative did not come from nowhere. It came from a media ecosystem that had a structural incentive to amplify the Drake camp's framing of Mr. Morale and a structural disincentive to push back on it. And Angle 3, the deepest layer, is the publishing and ownership structure of the modern rap deal. without naming any specific contracts that have not been publicly reported. The general industry pattern is well documented in publications like Music Business Worldwide and Hits Daily Double. Major label rap acts in the streaming era are increasingly evaluated not on artistic legacy, but on quarterly catalog performance. And the catalog performance metric is built around the same passive listening economics we just talked about, which means the entire industry incentive structure is engineered to define an album like Mr. Morale as a failure regardless of its actual cultural impact. The infrastructure for celebrating an album like this, in the way To Pimp a Butterfly was celebrated in the pre-streaming saturation era, no longer exists in the same form. That is the system Kendrick walked into when he released this record. That is the system Drake leveraged when he dropped the Brick line. And that is the system Mikal Bridges just publicly contradicted with one Instagram Live confession, because what Bridges said cannot be playlist, cannot be algorithmically suppressed, cannot be discounted by an access journalism outlet, and cannot be reframed by a label-friendly media cycle. He spoke directly to the listener, and what he said was that the album the system tried to bury saved his life. That is the gear shift this entire conversation needed. And it is the reason Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is not just one of the most important rap albums of the decade. It is one of the most important rap albums of the streaming era, full stop, because of what it survived to remain meaningful. And here is the truth bomb that nobody on either side of the Drake-Kendrick conversation has been willing to drop directly. So I will drop it here. The brick narrative around Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers was never about whether the album was good. The brick narrative was about whether the music industry in 2022 was going to be allowed to keep telling rap fans that the only valid version of mainstream hip-hop was the version that maximized streaming returns. Mr. Morale was a direct, deliberate, structural threat to that arrangement, because it proved that the most important rap album of the decade could be made without a single concession to the playlist economy. And that proof, if it had been allowed to land cleanly, would have shifted the entire commercial direction of the genre. That is the real reason Drake needed to call it a brick. That is the real reason mainstream rap media needed to label it self-indulgent. That is the real reason the album was systematically denied the cultural celebration that lesser albums in the same release window received as a matter of routine. And the most damaging part of this entire situation, the part that the Drake camp will never be able to walk back, is that they were not just wrong about the album. They were specifically wrong in the exact way Kendrick predicted they would be on Meet the Grahams, when he said that people like Drake are the reason he made Mr. Morale in the first place. That is not a coincidental lyric. That is a man who watched the streaming economy turn hip-hop into background music, who watched his own peers reduce their artistic ambition to fit the algorithm, who watched the most commercially dominant rapper of the decade build an empire on exactly the kind of passive listening product Kendrick refused to make, and who decided to respond by making the album that the system was structurally designed to reject. And then, 4 years later, an NBA champion sat on Instagram Live, drunk and emotionally exposed, and confirmed every single thing Kendrick was trying to do with that record. The brick line did not survive that moment. The tragic line did not survive that moment. The 2 years of access journalism framing did not survive that moment. Because the entire architecture of the brick narrative depended on the assumption that nobody important would ever publicly admit to being saved by Mr. Morale. And then someone important did, and the entire structure collapsed at once. That is the truth. That is the receipt. That is the moment 4 years of manufactured consensus broke in real time, and there is no putting it back together. The album the system tried to bury was the album that saved the only person in the room, everyone in America, was watching the night the Knicks won a championship. And once you understand that, you understand why this is not just a viral clip. This is the closing argument in the most important critical debate hip-hop has had this decade. And here is the resolution everybody who has been paying attention already feels in their chest. The right person is still winning. Kendrick Lamar made the album the industry was designed to reject, and 4 years later, on the night the New York Knicks won the NBA championship, the system that tried to bury that album was overruled by a single confession from a man who had no professional reason to make it. Kendrick did not need to win this argument with another diss track. He did not need to argue with Drake on Drake's terms. He did not need to chase the playlist economy or soften the album in retrospect or release a stripped-down version with shorter songs for the algorithm. He just had to wait. He just had to keep being the artist who does every job to 100%. The unfazed one, the disciplined one, the one who kept building the body of work while everybody else was chasing the moment. And while the rest of the conversation was busy trying to convince an entire fan base that this album was a failure, the album itself was quietly doing the only job that actually mattered. It was saving people. It was reaching the person sitting in a Phoenix hotel room, thinking he could not get out of the hole he was in. It was reaching the person in Dallas, wondering whether he was going to make it through the next season. It was reaching every listener who, like Mikal Bridges, did not have the language for what they were carrying until Kendrick handed them the language on Mother, I Sober, and Count Me Out and United in Grief. One artist made an album that pacified the listener. The other made an album that electrified the listener. One artist needed the system to call him great. The other artist made the album the system tried to bury. And 4 years later the system is the one apologizing. That is the contrast. That is the closing line. That is the version of this story that has been true the entire time, and we are only now allowed to say it out loud because an NBA champion on Instagram finally cleared the path. And the satisfying part, the part that justifies the 4 years of patience from everybody who knew this album was a masterpiece the moment it dropped, is that nothing about this resolution is uncertain anymore. The narrative has flipped. The cultural consensus has caught up. The blueprint has been adopted by the most influential artists in the genre. The streaming economy was overruled by a single live stream. And the rapper who was supposed to lose the long game on this album is, for years later, in a stronger creative and cultural position than any of his competitors. The right person is still winning. The disciplined one. The one who did not chase. The one who trusted the work. And the work, exactly as it was designed to do, found the people who needed it most and changed their lives in the dark on its own timeline, without permission from a system that tried to suppress it. And this is only the start because what just happened on Mikal Bridges' Live is not the end of the Mr. Morale reevaluation. It is the opening shot. There are 2 specific developments coming that you're going to want to be subscribed for because both of them are going to land in the next few months. And both of them are going to make the brick narrative look even more embarrassing in retrospect than it already does. The first development is the Kendrick album that, according to multiple insider reports and industry trackers, is being lined up for a 2026 release window. We are already hearing the early movement, and the rollout pattern that took over the Iceman cycle and powered the GNX moment is being repeated, which means the next era is closer than the casual fan realizes. The second development is the Drake response cycle that is going to be forced to engage with the Mr. Morale reevaluation whether the OVO camp wants to or not. Because the Mikal Bridges moment did not just go viral, it became part of the permanent public record of this rivalry. And any future Drake project is going to have to navigate the fact that the brick line did not age the way it was supposed to age. Both of those stories are coming. Both of those stories are going to break here first. And the only way to make sure you do not miss the breakdown, the receipts, and the analysis that goes deeper than anybody else in this space is going to provide is to be subscribed right now and have the notifications on. Because when the next move drops, this channel is not waiting 24 hours to react. We are going to be live the same hour with a full breakdown. And if you want to see exactly how we got here, exactly how the Drake camp built the brick narrative in the first place, and why it was always going to collapse the moment a single high-profile cosign broke through, the next video you need to watch is the one I just pinned in the description, because what Drake did in the silent 12 months before the public phase of the beef, the moves he made in the studio, the rooms he was in, and the one specific industry decision that locked him into the position he is in right now, is the missing piece that makes this entire story click into place. And trust me, you are not going to want to see it from anybody else first.